Okay. Okay. So we're just waiting for it to load back up here. Okay. So basically you can see the layers basically. Okay. So if you start in the center, you've got the pith. Okay. Then this layer is the primary xylem. Now remember, xylem is always closer to the center of the plant as well. And then there's the vascular cambium, the phloem, and then the cortex. Okay. Now, basically, what's going to happen here is that the vascular cambium forms between the xylem and the phloem. And so it creates new phloem on one side and new xylem on the other. Does that make sense? So it's like kind of like sandwich, it's like almost like tectonic plates pushing out. Does that kind of make sense? Okay. Now, in mature stems, the vascular cambium adds new layers of secondary xylem and phloem each year. And that's what forms the rings in the trees, is this vascular cambium. So when you're looking at a stem, hang on, I'm walking over to the stems, guys. Okay. Okay. So when you're looking at the stems, right, this is the center of the tree. So this is the pith here. Of course, I've cut this into like fourths. So hopefully you guys can see here. So this is the pith right here. This is the pith. Again, cut into fourths, right? That means that in this layer, in these layers, these growth rings, these are all old years of growth. Okay. Now the living layers are all the way up here. Okay. Does that make sense? Now, if what you're doing is making xylem on this side and phloem on this side, right? Xylem closer in, phloem further out. That means that the majority of the tree, all this dead or vascular tissue here is all xylem, dead xylem tubes, because that's being added on the inside. The phloem eventually gets pushed out and becomes the bark. So the bark is constantly worn away. So the old dead layers of phloem become protection on the outside. The old dead layers of xylem become support structures that hold up the tree. Does that make sense? Kind of? Okay. Now, this is the layer right here, secondary phloem and secondary xylem. These are the new layers being formed. Right here, sorry. Right here, this one and this one. Right around the vascular cambium. These layers, the primary phloem and the primary xylem, they're the vascular networks that are primarily being used. They're fully functional. They're newer cells, they're still alive, they're functioning. Okay, does that make sense? The secondary is where growth is happening. And then the cambium is the layer on the inside. Okay. Now, if you're a tree, right, that means that it's kind of important that the outside layer is protected then. Okay. Now, any questions on that? Okay. Now, at least in deciduous forests like where we live, okay, growth happens quite a bit during the spring and summer, and then slows over fall and winter, right? Leaves drop, less sunlight, less photosynthesis. And that gradation and density of growth is also what creates the rings. Does that make sense? So the vascular bundles get wider during the spring and the summer, which creates like the actual rings in the tree that you see. Okay? So a tree or a plant typically never stops growing. Okay. The same type of, and that's what can make plants so difficult, is there can be like a little tree this big that's flowering, and it's the same tree as a 80-foot tree, but this one's just like 15 or 20 years old. Okay. So it can be very difficult sometimes to identify plants. Okay. So they're continuously making new cells in what we call their meristems, which we talked about. Okay. Now the cool part is like animals, like there are certain genes that animals activate, especially mammals. Like when you're an infant, right? There are going to be genes active in your genetic code that are eventually turned off. Okay. Does that make sense? One of those might be like the gene for creating lactase, which is an enzyme to digest breast milk. Okay. It's normal for that gene to be turned off once you reach like childhood, right? Because you're not drinking breast milk anymore, usually. Okay. Now, in plants, that doesn't happen. The genes don't have to be turned on and off because plants are always growing in every tissue type. Does that make sense? And not always all the, like you're not always growing flowers, but you always have the potential to. So you're not turning that gene off. Okay. Which is really cool to think about actually. So I'm just trying to see if there's anything else I wanted to talk to you about. Well, I guess just last thing is that there are a lot of nutrients besides like photosynthesis is important for sugar, but the plant does need other minerals to grow. Okay. So plants also require up to like 14 other elements. Okay. And so that is something to keep in mind. Okay. Roots are really important for getting those. Any questions about this at all? Any questions at all? None. Any questions from Zoom? Okay.